Welcome to Quilting's first reality show, live and unscripted, with Susan Smith.
Hello and welcome. I am Susan Smith and you are in my studio, Stitched by Susan. Today's live and unscripted episode is all about starting and stopping. So whether you're working at a long arm, a sit-down machine, a domestic sewing machine, it's all about dealing with bobbin threads and dealing with thread tails and when it's appropriate to break thread and when you might want to avoid it and how the mechanics of it work and all those things. So it's going to be casual because it is live. You are free to chime in your questions at any time. I will look up from time to time and read those questions and try to answer them. But I thought I would just demonstrate. I've got my long arm all set up and I'll demonstrate some of these different methods because there's no one right way of stopping and starting or joining threads or what happens when your thread breaks, all those things. So we're going to talk about that today. So before we dive right in, lots of you have been chiming in. I'm seeing people watching, honestly, from all over the world. There's someone here from Austria, someone from Brazil, and of course, all over the United States and Canada. So thank you so much for taking the time to tune in. These live and unscripted episodes always are quite casual, and they're always real. We do not edit them. So they're streamed in real time, and my last couple of episodes, I've been having thread break and tension issues at my machine, and I've let it be. That's just part of the show. That's part of the process. And I hope that that's encouraging for you. I don't want it to discourage you to say, oh my goodness, that's what I have to look forward to if I get a long arm, because it's not always like that. But the truth is that it's sometimes like that, and problems have to be resolved. I cannot even fully say I've resolved the problems at my machine yet, but I'm working toward them. I keep trying different variables. I keep calling different people and reaching out to other quilters. What other things can I try? What do you suggest? Because there is a wealth of knowledge in the quilting world. So I appreciate those of you who have extended ideas and help, and many of you watching the show were typing in ideas too as those various things were happening. But anyway, that's kind of what this show is about, showing you projects in my studio. So more often I'm quilting a whole project, and it's often a client quilt. So it's not a lesson or a tutorial necessarily. It's just letting you see as I work through the project, talking through it a little bit as I go. Today is a bit more tutorial style in that I'm going to show you specifically different ways of stopping and starting and splicing threads as you're working on a quilted project. So I really hope that it's helpful for you and that it helps you when you come to making decisions at your own project. So before we get started, just a couple of places that I can be found. Obviously, one is on YouTube and Facebook. You'll be watching this in one of those places. I would love if you would give this episode a thumbs up if you find this style of learning helpful and encouraging. Thumbs up and subscribe. On YouTube, if you click the little bell, you will get notifications whenever I go live. So typically these live episodes are on a Friday morning. I used to schedule them certain Fridays of the month. I'm doing more traveling. That's not working as well, but as often as we can, we'll come live, and it's always on a Friday morning at 9 a.m. Pacific time. So that will help you to know when they're coming up, and clicking that bell will let you get a notification. As well, I try to let you know in my newsletter in advance what the episode is going to be about, so you can see if it's of interest to you. I sent a newsletter out yesterday, for example. I know it was last minute, and I invite you to share that with your friends that you think might be interested in the same types of ideas as well. So if you are not yet on my newsletter list, you can just go to my website, stitchedbysusan.com, and you'll get a little pop-up there inviting you for some freebie. I can't even think what it is right now, but signing up for that will get you on my newsletter list. In addition, if you're interested in supporting this channel, you can do that quite easily by going to buymeacoffee.com/Stitched by Susan. So there you can make a contribution of as little as $5 one time, or if you wish, you can sign up to make that a monthly commitment. And all of the funds that we receive there go directly into upgrading our equipment for this show. If you look back a year, 2 or 3, you'll see a difference. Also, we're learning, but that's where those dollars go, is to upgrade our cameras and our cables and so forth. So we appreciate that. You'll be seeing a lot of close-up shots today, and that camera is a new one. It's a GoPro. So for those of you who are involved perhaps in sports, or your kids are, GoPros are designed to deal with motion and movement and vibration. So it's the perfect camera to have on the long arm. So we recently upgraded that one. So you'll be seeing shiny new camera at work today. Hopefully all goes smoothly. Fingers crossed. What else did I want to talk about, hon? Is that about it? Yeah, I should give a few credits. Dave says I want to talk about him for a minute. So I will, just to oblige him. A few credits, though. This is my husband, Dave, Mr. Producer. So this is not a one-woman show, believe me. So Dave does all the work of being behind the scenes and operating the cameras and changing the scenes and the sound levels and all those things. So most of our shows, we have 5 cameras going. So it's a bit of a job to stay on top of all those things. So I appreciate that. And then our son Will is the one who does the introductions with the different voices. I think it was the French voice today, if I recall correctly. He does those voices for me. Oh, it was Inspector General today. Sorry. So thanks to Will for that. And then lastly, but not least, our good friend Dan Unger, who provides the beautiful guitar music that will be playing throughout the show. Sadly, it is not available for purchase. You have to come and watch the show to listen to it. So we appreciate Dan graciously allowing us to use it. So that's the credits. Alrighty, let me get one more sip in and we're going to get right at it. So in terms of setup today, I am sewing on a Bernina Q24. Her name is Stella. And I've just loaded a solid color of fabric so that you can really see what the stitching is today. Here it is, this kind of iris or clematis colored fabric. And I've got a really dark teal thread so that you can hopefully see well. And you know what, Dave? I'm going to turn the machine lights off. That's something that we missed in our hurry to get ready. There we go. That should make things a little more visible as I'm stitching. So I've loaded my fabric and I just used a scrap of batting. So it's a wool. So it's going to be fluffy. I don't know if that's going to make seeing the stitches easier or more difficult, but that's what I had on hand as a scrap. So that's what we'll be using. So let's talk about anchoring threads. As I mentioned earlier, these tips are all going to apply no matter what type of machine you're stitching at. So I'm on a long arm, but even if you were at your domestic sewing machine, one thing that you always want to start with is pulling up your bobbin thread. So you do that by hanging on to your top thread. I'm going to go ahead and feed mine into my presser foot. Hang on to that top thread and take one stitch. First, you've got to get your machine back into stitching mode. There we go. One stitch. Now that stitch has pulled up my bobbin thread. Can you see that little loop? So I'm just going to grab that bobbin thread and pull. And now I've got both threads in my hand. From here, you might choose different methods. You might wind it a couple times around your finger. You might just set down your finger firmly. You might even, I'll show you this one because it comes in useful. Hang on a sec while I grab a pin. You might even put a pin and literally anchor the threads around the pin. So there's lots of ways you can do that, but in some way you need to hang on to these threads. This, in my opinion, is non-negotiable. You do this every time you start stitching. If you don't, you will get a thread gnat on the bottom side. There's no doubt about it. You can't just let that bobbin thread hang and start stitching. So we've got both threads now. They're both under control and we're ready to start stitching. So that is the most simple beginning. I'm going to kind of talk first about the simpler, more efficient, more maybe utilitarian ways of stopping and starting and joining threads. And then later we'll get into the more custom ways that are a little more high-end, less visible, more perfect, and reasons why you might want to do that. So let's for a moment stop, and then I'm going to do another start for you with some lock stitches and really anchoring that stitching. Because here I just began stitching, which, you know, if you're off in the basting edge, for example, that's going to be, it's an end that's not going to be in the usable portion of your quilt, that would be okay to just start stitching. But usually you will actually do some lock stitches. And maybe I could just do that where I am actually. Lock stitches are like this. A few stitches really close. Let me lift my needle and move away and see if you can see them. I've got my machine set to do 5 automatically, so I can push one button and get 5 tiny stitches, and they're in about 1/8 of an inch. I might even aim for less. What you don't want to do is put all those lock stitches in one needle hole, or you're just going to get twisted yarns, but not really lock stitching, right? You do want a little tiny bit of space. It could be as little as a thread for each stitch. Your machine may or may not have the one button lock stitch, and that's totally fine. You can just take one. That works fine too. But whatever you do, get those really tight, really close stitches, and that is what keeps your stitching from ever coming undone. Now, when we come to the end of our stitching, we kind of reverse the process of this bobbin thread pulling up. And the reason for it at the end is that you want that bobbin thread to be cut close to the quilt. So if I were to just pull it up somewhere over here where I am now and snip that bobbin thread, I would have a tail on the bottom side of my quilt, right? And I wouldn't be able to see that tail. So when I go on quilting, I'll end up quilting that tail in, and that will be frustrating. Or if the tail is a 1/4 inch long, I'm going to end up with a little thread, you know, sticky uppy eyelash on the bottom of my quilt, and I don't want that either. So my goal is to pull up that bobbin thread and trim it right close to the quilt. So what I've done is I've grabbed my top thread again, hanging on to it just like I did with the initial bobbin pull. Take one stitch, okay? And there again, see my bobbin thread, that little loop? I will grab it again and pull. And in this case, I like to move my machine away because, let me get back where you can see me. I like to pull my machine away. There you can see me. And I'm away 3 or 4 inches because this bobbin thread, the white one, is still attached to my bobbin, which is right down here. And I want a bit of length on there so that when I go to start the next time, I've got a bobbin thread to pull. If I were to do it with my needle right here and clip, the bobbin thread would be so short, when I went to pull it up next time, I wouldn't have any. Does that make sense? These are the things that are hard to show you on camera. But now that I've pulled my machine away while holding on to the bobbin thread, I know that there's a tail under there. So now tugging good and firmly on them and often even running my fingernail to make sure it's pulled taut underneath, now I use my little curved scissors to clip right by the quilt. I'm going to try and get the best light on that I can. There we go. So you can see that is a nice little anchoring end. I've done it on a corner, but you could have done it on a straight stitch too. It's fairly invisible, fairly low key, and that's a perfect way to end your stitching. So let's do some of those some more so you can see it again. So here again, if I was working at a quilt, I would typically go over within my basting seam to start. I'm taking one stitch while hanging on to this thread. I'm pulling up my bobbin thread and hanging on to both of them. So since I'm in this basting edge, I could just launch into my quilting, or if I feel more comfortable, I can do my little lock stitches and just anchor that fully in place. Then I can let go of my thread tails. And off I go into quilting from there. Let me move the machine so that you can see my beginning. A little bit more, there we go. When I launch into my stitching, there is room under my hopper foot that I could do the lock stitches and right away stop and clip the threads. The reason I don't is experience has taught me that those lock stitches, while they hold a seam well in place, if I only do lock stitches, cut the threads, and then start sewing, that jerk on the threads when I launch into sewing often will pull the lock stitches right out. So I always go and sew a couple of inches and then come back. My machine keeps wanting to move because the camera wires are pulling it a little bit. Then I come back and trim those threads. So let's do that in the middle of a quilt. I'm not ending all of these like I would on a quilt because it would just take forever. But let me show you, if I was starting in the middle of a quilt, maybe at the corner of a block, how that might look. I would do my little lock stitches like so, and I would go off into my quilting a few inches. Stay in a place where you guys can see it. And now that I've stitched a couple of inches, I will come back and clip those threads. And you can still see my beginning. That is very unobtrusive. That is perfectly acceptable anywhere in a quilt. So let's talk for a minute about why you might want to stop or start. And there's a couple of reasons. One would be certainly if you're doing custom quilting, but we're going to talk about that more in a minute. At the moment, though, let's kind of stick to what I would call edge-to-edge quilting, so something that's quilted across the entire surface of a quilt. Why might you need to stop or start in the middle of a quilt? Well, how about a thread break, folks? If you've been watching me again the last couple of episodes, I've had a bunch of them. And so I'm stitching along, and for whatever reason, my top thread snaps. And I've got, it's ended. Like there's no two things about it. I've got to have a splice in the middle of my quilt. Couple things to think about. One of them is if my top thread broke, chances are my bobbin thread is still attached underneath, right? So the first thing I would do, rethread my needle, do all the things that I've got to do to try to fix that thread break. But when it comes to join, first thing I would do is take a stitch right where I left off or very close to it. Like so, pull up that bobbin thread because it's still attached to my bobbin. Move my machine away a little so I've got a tail and cut that bobbin thread. Now I'm starting fresh, okay? Here's how I would do my splice. I'm going to back up at least 2 stitches or 3, about 1/4 inch, and I'm going to start with my bobbin thread pull. So take 1 stitch, grab that bobbin thread, hang on to it. Then I will go ahead and do my lock stitches right over top of the last stitching. And of course, because I'm using contrasting thread and because I'm on camera, it's not perfect, but you will see what I've done. And then I proceed to quilt. Right there where you can see it, clip those threads, and there's my join. Is it right in the shadow? Let me move just a little. It's so tricky to control the light. There we go. Now you can see it. So it is visible because there is 2 layers of thread over that little area, but it is also quite secure. I have never had one of these come undone, and I have a fair number of what I call couch quilts in my house. They get used, they get washed, they get snuggled in, they get drug around. I've never had these come undone on me. So that process of overlapping a little bit, doing some lock stitches, it anchors the one that was broken and it anchors the new one, and then proceeding into the quilting. If, on this solid fabric, you can see it a little. But if you were on any kind of print or if you had a thread color that matched, that would be very unobtrusive and, to my way of thinking, a perfectly acceptable way of splicing, and it is certainly an easy way. Let us stop and take a few questions because that's kind of the end of my utilitarian methods, and then we'll go into some more custom ways of doing it. So let me break my thread here. So quilters will often use breaking thread as the term for stopping, cutting your thread and going on. So when we talk about breaking thread, when you're doing custom work from block to block, you break thread in between them, or when you're changing colors, you break thread. That's what that term means. It just means I'm stopping, I'm ending with my thread tails, and I'm going to start again somewhere else. So let's move Stella. That's the name of my long arm. Let's move Stella out a little bit. Boy, my face is really in shadow today. Let's see if I stand back, if you can see me a little better. Let's talk about some questions. I am ready. Yvonne, I know this is off topic, but what needle would you use when quilting a quilt with rayon fabric that's been stabilized? I don't think I have a great answer for you, Yvonne. Maybe some of the people seeing this in the chat window can answer. I don't think I've ever done a whole quilt that was rayon. I've only done like mixed sort of memory quilts that have multiple different things in, and I just went with my usual needle, which is an 80 or a 90 typically. So, but someone else may have a great answer for that, and they're welcome to type in. Margaret, what is the preferred method for a quilt that will be judged? We'll get into that a little bit more in the custom quilting. We'll get into that a little bit more. Let's just put it that way for now. Sue, is it okay to put those anchor stitches back and forth over top of each other, almost like back stitching? It is okay, Sue. The more passes you have over it, the darker and more visible it's going to be. So, if you're quilting on a blue floral, for example, blue on blue, it's fine. That's not going to show. Certainly that will be solidly secure. If you're quilting on a solid like this one, you might not want to do that because it will show more. You'll have 3 or 4 layers of thread as opposed to just 2. Karen, what do you use for stitch length? I currently have my machine set at 10. 10 or 11 is kind of my go-to. Sandy, Susan, I have a button for half stitch. Would that have something to do with starting and stopping? I think a half stitch is probably like just down or just up. So you could certainly use it for starting and stopping. That's more used for custom when you need just that half stitch. Generally for starting and stopping, you want the whole stitch. You want the whole revolution of the needle. But certainly you could press it twice. It's just 2 pushes instead of 1. Denise, what distance would you say your foot is from the surface of the quilt? Seems to touch the quilt when you're basting before your hopper foot goes down to take a stitch. Let me just have a look here. It does almost touch the surface, Denise, not quite. That's kind of because I have wool batting, which is quite lofty. That is something that varies very much from machine to machine. On my Bernina now, there is a presser foot lift, much like a sewing machine would have. So when I'm not stitching, that presser foot is quite high. I don't really worry about what height it is, sort of resting. I worry about what height it is when I'm stitching. It should be just skimming the fabric when you're stitching. Again, on my Bernina, I can literally adjust the height of my hopper foot just with the turn of a knob on the foot, and I can adjust that pressure a little bit. On some other machines, you have to change the whole needle bar in order to, or hopper foot bar in order to change what that height is. It's a good point. I can't really give a definitive answer for what you want to achieve, but I know on mine, I want it when it's coming down to just be skimming the surface of the fabric when it's stitching. Camera's really in the way, isn't it? Stella doesn't want to stay rolled away. Diane, are you moving the machine when you do lock stitches, or does the lock stitch feature do it? I'm moving the machine. The lock stitch feature on mine just instructs the machine to take 5 stitches, and I've set it for that. I could set it for 3 or for 8 or whatever I wanted, but I chose 5, and it just goes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 when I push the 1 button, but I have to move the machine that little tiny touch. Barbara, definitely a ballpoint on rayon. Great, good to know. I'm glad you knew that, Barbara, because I didn't. Georgia, I hope you'll show how to handle running out of bobbin thread. You bet I will. I don't know if I can replicate it without running out of bobbin. I should have thought of that. I should have put a bobbin in there that only had 2 feet on it, but I didn't. Gainer, how do you lock stitch if you don't have a lock stitch option on your machine? Well, I think every machine will have a single stitch option of some form. And so I literally, and my last machine was like that too, I literally just took 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 stitches to get my lock stitch. Lauren, is there a good way to make sure the stitches will be lined up when stitching over threads? You know, it comes down to machine control. If you're not comfortable doing that, you might try actually lining up a ruler with your stop and start, any ruler, just so that you've got something to rest your hopper foot against. So you could even put your thread tails out there, put your ruler on top and use that as a thread tail holder, right? And it would help you keep those lock stitches right in place. There's no mechanical built-in way to do it. That's your control, yeah. Okay, we think that's all the questions. One more sip of lukewarm coffee. On we go. Okay, let's talk a bit about custom quilting. And you guys, I'll be honest, I had this bright idea. I was going to try and have a series of pictures to show you. Today, we had company overnight and I just didn't get all of that done. So I might actually do another episode that has those pictures involved because I could point some things out in it. The one that I wanted to show you was the very first custom quilt that I ever quilted. And because I'm me, I dive in with both feet. It was like the 4th quilt I ever quilted on a long arm. And so I just dived right in. And it was my own. And it had these kind of picture window blocks. So there was a colored portion in the center with a little white border and then a colored background. And there was all these windows all over the quilt. Long story short, I wanted to quilt something in the colored block, something in the white border, and then something in all the background that was between the windows. And so, of course, the first question in my mind that I had no idea what was appropriate was, do I have to start and stop stitching for every center, for every white border, and then for the background area? Like, what's appropriate to start and stop? Is it going to take me forever if I have 100 starts and stops in a quilt? Or is that even, are you allowed to do that? Well, the short answer is you can do whatever you're willing to spend the time on. And I will say, I did choose each center block because they had a colored thread, and then each white border because they were white, and I was doing a kind of bubbly design which didn't lend itself to going to the edge. And then I did a different thread color for the whole background. So that is what I did. I did the white borders first. I loaded my white thread and I did white border after white border after white border. And then I came and did the center parts, and then I went and did the background. So how many windows were in that quilt? At least 50. So therefore I had 50, 50, 100 changes plus the background, which I kind of could travel around. In practice, that was not awful. For that first quilt, it took me a very, very long time. But as you quilt more and more, these thread breaks become less threatening, and you realize, oh, it really is not that big a deal. It's just a second or two to do them. So do as many as you need to make your quilting convenient. But also, were I doing that quilt again today, I might think about, with the white borders and the windows, choosing a color that worked on both. I might even use white or like an eggshell thread and maybe a finer thread that wouldn't show up so much on the colored windows, so that I could do the white border and do that inner window, thus cutting my thread breaks in half. So those are things you can consider, but that is entirely up to you how much or how little of those you did. I think one of my records was not that long ago, maybe a year ago. I did a quilt for a lady and it was beautifully hand appliqued, which, to me, it's absolutely sacrilege, really, to quilt even over a stem on a leaf. So I lost counting at 400 thread stops and starts on that quilt. That to me was a little bit much. That was starting to get unwieldy. But how would I know unless I tried that? So I encourage you, just experiment with it. But as you get more comfortable with the thread stops and starts, you might find you're fine with doing them. And honestly, with this little method of lock stitching, they don't take very long at all. So we're going to go now into some more custom details, and we're going to tie and bury our threads, which is the very invisible, very sharp, very professional way of doing it, and which you probably want to do for show quilts. And this does take more time. So again, this should be a consideration in your process of how much time you want to spend on a quilt. Trying to think of an example. I did one a year or two ago that was a linen quilt, and it had like an ecru background, and then it had large rose blocks. So every rose had to be quilted, and then the background had kind of geometric custom, so you couldn't move around the quilt in it. So every area, that had to be done separately too. So I did do stops and starts on that one. And somehow, because of that linen weave, this lock stitch seemed to show more. So I talked with the quilt owner about it, and she decided she wanted tied and buried threads. And I negotiated, okay, if I do it, it's going to cost X amount, because every tying and burying, as you're going to see in a minute, takes, instead of 1 or 2 seconds, takes 25 or 30 seconds. You times that by 150 and you've got quite a bit of time, right? So what we negotiated in her case was she would do the tying and burying. So that's a quilt you probably did not see pictures of on social media, because when I gave it back to her, it had long hairs sprouting everywhere. It had thread tails everywhere. And she chose to do that. She was going to sit evenings and tie and bury threads. I know there are quilters who only tie and bury. They kind of think that's the only way to go. I don't. I prefer to be quicker about it. So, but I'll show you that, and you can decide for yourself and try which ones you want to do. So one of the tools that I think is important for tying and burying is the type of needle that you use. And Dave, if we put the close-up camera on, they may be able to see this against the fabric. Let's give it a try. Ooh, well, you can see the needle. What I don't know if you can see, but I think you can as I turn it, it's called a spiral eye needle or a self-threading needle. So basically, it's got a little slit on the side of the eye. So I can just rub my threads across it. Let's see if I can do this well on camera here. Do you see that? And my needle is threaded. So that to me is critical for this tying and burying process, because you're going to have thread tails that are a few inches long, and you've got to thread a needle. And it's really difficult with 4 inches of thread, to thread that needle and to get both of them in there. Where when you've got tails in this self-threading needle, you just brush it across and it's in, just like that. So you can find them anywhere. Craft stores have them. Amazon has them. So spiral eye or self-threading needles. So let's do some stitching and we'll lock stitch some threads. Remind me, you guys, because I realize I have not done what to do when your bobbin thread runs out, and I will come back to that one. Yes, that's how I'll do it. Okay, so we're pulling up a bobbin thread, starting as we always would, grabbing that bobbin tail. Can you see how short it is? I really didn't pull it quite long enough, as long as I would have wished on my last one, and this is how you know. If it's only a 1/4 inch long and you can't grab it, you know that when you're ending, you need to give yourself a little more space, a little longer tail, right? But once I can grab it, I can hang on to it. Let's start stitching. Let's pretend we're going to stitch our boxes again, and we're going to pretend we're doing some custom work, and we've got to change maybe thread colors, or maybe our bobbin runs out. Let's pretend our bobbin has run out. So in that case, I wouldn't be pulling up the bobbin thread because there wouldn't be any, but let's just pretend the bobbin thread has run out. And I want to have a nice long, where's my finger? I want to have a nice long straight line down here, and I'm right in the middle of it. What am I going to do? If I'm on a custom quilt or a solid colored quilt like this, I would try to not do this splice in a long straight area. That's going to be very visible. Instead, I would back up to somewhere where it wouldn't show as much. Likewise, if I had run out of bobbin thread, this last little bit would have poor tension on it because it wouldn't have been running through the bobbin tension, right? So again, I would go back until the stitches are looking good and also go back to somewhere where it's unobtrusive, which is going to be a corner. So whether you're stitching boxes like this or whether you're stitching flower petals or leaves, there's bound to be a corner somewhere. So I go to just after that corner. Can you see that? I've left about 2 stitches after the corner. I'm tugging on my threads fairly firmly because remember, I want my bobbin thread to be cut short. I don't want a little burr on the bottom. Trim them right off. And then I'm going to start stitching right in the corner. And I have so much apparatus around me, it remains to be seen if I can hit the corner exactly. I didn't, so I'm just going to do it again. There we go. This time I hit it. So I've pulled my bobbin thread up. I'm trying to. There it is. I've got it. Let me just grab a ruler and I'll show you what I was recommending to one of you for holding it still. If it helps you, do get a ruler and put it right beside. Now, in the case of my Bernina, I need to have my presser foot down when I'm doing that, so I know exactly where my ruler is placed. I'm going to put my ruler right on the thread tails to hold them, and this will be my barrier so that I keep those lock stitches right in place, and I can shift it and adjust it. Can you see I'm doing that? Till my needle is lined up. Here come my lock stitches, and I'm up and away. Let's cut those threads. And there's my join. So it is there. There is an overlap of a couple of stitches, but being as it's at a corner, it's less visible than it might otherwise be. And you guys, I'm sure you know this about me by now. I can't always talk and keep my train of thought running on the rails at the same time. So I realized we were actually going to talk about tying and burying, and here I went into being on a corner. But this also applies when we're tying and burying, this idea of trying to make it as invisible as possible. Where you place it helps with that. So I wouldn't necessarily try to tie and bury my threads along a long straight line of stitching. I would try also to do that at a corner. But here's how I would do it. This is going to be my corner. So I'm going to go ahead and break thread, but I have not done lock stitches for ending. I'm just going to get that bobbin thread and pull it up. So 1 stitch, trying to get it in the last hole in which I stitched. Come on, little bobbin thread, you know you want to. Huh. It's always something, isn't it? There it comes. This time, though, I'm actually going to pull some substantial tails. And by substantial, I mean minimum of 4 inches. 6 is better. So, can you see my tails over here? Here they are. Long tails. My bobbin thread is still a loop because it's still attached, and I'm going to cut all my threads right there. So now when I move the machine away a little bit, I'm pulling my loose bobbin thread through, and now I'll pull my machine back. Now I've got these tails, top and bottom thread, that are about 5 inches long. I think we'll do one close-up version and one further one of the needle. And I think it would be easier to do the further one first, Dave, so they have the big picture view of what I'm going to do, and then I'll show it close up. You do have both views. Okay, that might do it. Here's my thread tails. Let me get to where you can see. Here's my thread tails. I'm going to take those both, go around a finger or two. You see what I'm doing? And now I'm pinching my 2 fingers apart, putting the thread tail through the middle. I'm just making a simple knot is all I'm doing. So now I've got a loop with my tails in it. Here's a trick. Grab your little tying needle, put the point of the needle right where you want that knot to land, right where your last stitch was. And now as you pull the knot, it will end up being right there by that stitching. And I'll do this a couple of times so that you can see it. Now the knot is around my needle. I can take my needle out, and it's within a 1/16 of an inch of that fabric. It's really close. Now I'll take my trusty self-threading needle, brush it across, and both threads are in it now. Can you see that? My needle's threaded. And now I will enter the fabric right where that last stitch was and come up somewhere else, at least a 1/2 inch away. It doesn't matter where. You're not going to see it in a moment. What you're doing is you're going to bury these thread tails between the layers of your quilt. So you need to be sure you don't go through the quilt and out the bottom, or it will be one giant stitch. You want this needle to be going through the batting somewhere in the middle there. And you pull the needle and give the tiniest of tugs, and that knot pulls right inside. And cut close to the fabric, and it's gone. I'm going to go ahead and start stitching again, tie and bury again. I'll do this a couple of times for you with a couple of camera angles so you can get the best view possible. We'll just leave my little needles off to the side here so I don't lose them. So we're kind of going to do the same process for beginning. I've got really long thread tails. We're going to start right at that point again. Pull the thread tails generously long, like be at least 4 or 5 inches again. This time what's critical to get this be invisible is that we do not do a lock stitch. We want to launch right into the appropriate length of stitches as compared to what we were stitching before. Does that make sense? So right away, we're just going to go ahead and start stitching. And here we go. And I'm just going to move the machine out of the way and break the thread. And this is not going to be a proper ending or anything. I just want to get the machine out of the way and in the proper place for you to see what I'm doing. Okay, so now once again, as before, where are we here? I'm left with these long thread tails right at this corner. Okay, Mr. Producer's going to change cameras. Is that a better one? I think that's a good view right there, Dave. If you zoom in anymore, we can't see the whole thing going on. Okay, so here's my corner, right? I've already stitched this, tied and buried those ending threads. Now I'm going to tie off my beginning threads in that same corner. So very much the same process. I'm going to wrap it around my 2 fingers, right? And I've kind of formed a loop and go between there. There's my tie. Here's my trusty needle. It's kind of hard to work around my machine. And my needle point is going right at the end of my stitch where I want that knot to form. Pull the thread snug. Thread the needle. Go right in at that last stitch. And I will tell you already, this is not perfect because I'm working with my arms around the front of my machine and the camera. But you will get the gist of it. Go in where the stitch ended, come up somewhere else. My needle is going through the layers of the quilt. So this whole tail is going to be buried. That little tug pulled the knot in. Clip my threads. And now we have a join. You know, Susan was not perfect, but had I been, you would not be able to see that. The stitches are the same length approaching it. The stitches begin at the same length leaving it, and it just looks seamless. So theoretically, you can do that anywhere you are in your quilt, and you might need to. If you have a thread break and you're doing something delicate, or you don't have a corner, it's all curves, you might need to actually do it somewhere right here in the middle of your stitching. And with practice, you can do a really, really good job of that. You just come along, you end, tie and bury, you begin, and you set off stitching again, come back and tie and bury, and you can't see that at all. Both knots are underneath the fabric and both thread tails. And it is important that you leave that bit of thread tail, because if you were to cut it too close, too short of a tail, that knot would be apt to come out. So it's important that you have, I think, at least a ½ inch of tail there. So that is tying and burying. Let's go through that whole process one more time. I'll try it in the middle of a straight line or a curved line and see if I can, I'll see if I can make one for you guys. I'm nothing if not crazy doing this live for you. Let's do something that's curved. We've got a little daisy going on. Ah, we had a thread break right there. Can you imagine? And in practice, as I've said to you, I would probably go back to a point. But for the sake of argument today, we're going to say we've got to make a splice and it's going to show. So here's where it's going to be. Get my long thread tail. So I've actually got 3 threads here now. Can you see them all? There's my needle thread, which is the dark one, and there's my bobbin loop because it's still attached to the bobbin. So I'm cutting way over at the end of that loop. And I'm going to pull that attached bobbin thread out by moving my machine away and then come back. So now I just have 2. This is my cut bobbin thread. This is my cut needle thread. Around my fingers and catch it and pull it through. And where did I set my needle? On my little pin cushion. That's another story I could tell you. So here's the loop. Can you see that? I've just got a single knot. I'm going to put my needle through the loop and put the point of it right where that last stitch ended. That's where my knot is pulled tight. Thread the needle. There it's threaded. And insert my needle at that last stitch. Come up. My needle is now between the quilt layers. Come up. I'm a good 3/4 of an inch away. Pull that stitch through, tiny tug, and the knot pulls in. Done. Now comes the tricky part. This hole? Yes. Yes. That's where I came up with my needle, right? Just running a fingernail across it will make that go closed again. All right, the trick is to make a fresh one that matches exactly. So I'm going to attempt to drop my needle in exactly the same place. I was not exact, so I'm just going to pull that out and try it again. If you've got a laser pointer on your machine, it could be very helpful right here. I don't, so might have to invest in that. There we go. Now I got it in the same hole. Grab that bobbin thread, pull me some tails. I've got a good 6 inches of tails. I'm going to go ahead and lower my presser foot so I can see. Yep, looks good. I'm going to try now to just start stitching and have my little daisy shape continue on. Sort of. And now I'm going to break thread, and you might not be able to see as I'm moving my machine around, but give me a minute here to just get these thread tails cut. And let's go back to where we were. Okay, here's my threads from beginning. Okay, I've got my bobbin thread and my needle thread. Wrap around my 2 fingers, grab between the fingers. That's forming my knot. My needle gets the loop. My needle goes right where those stitches were, pulls that knot snug. Have to move the machine just a little to see. And I don't know that this is going to be a perfect join, but we're going to try. Taking my needle down right where the stitch began, coming up between the layers, tug, and there we have it. So, is it absolutely perfect? No, but you guys bear with me because I am working, around the cameras in the machine. But it is all there. I'm seeing just a tiny touch of white, which I think is a sniff of batting coming through. So I might take a needle and poke that back down through. But the stitching itself is fairly seamless. If we were not scrutinizing it this closely, you would not see that on a quilt. And I was able to maintain the curve. Both sets of thread tails are knotted off and their tails are underneath, so they're not going to come undone, and I'm pretty confident that that is secure. So this is the kind of thing. Let me get my coffee cup, Dave, and move Stella. We're going to talk for a couple minutes. If you guys have questions, it's a great time for them. But let's kind of talk about when you might want to do this or why. You know, quilting for shows, even that is a broad category of quilting. So when I quilt for shows, I have quilts that are displayed in a show that are maybe even up for winning ribbons in a show, but I'm not usually attempting, you know, to be at Paducah, for example, getting best of show. That's not the league that I personally quilt in, right? I might aim for best of show at my local quilt guild, but the types of lock stitching that I showed you early on is what I continue to do even on those quilts. Unless I have a very visible join, I will continue to do those lock stitches. So I kind of weigh it as I'm quilting. Am I in the middle of a flower? Is it something that would really show? I might take the time to tie and bury it. But by and large, if I was doing something like the custom quilt I described for you with the window, the white border, the background, I would do the lock stitches on those. I would begin and end in those blocks with a couple tight lock stitches. And that is perfectly satisfactory for that type of judged quilt. Now, you might decide, well, it'll give me an edge if I have invisible joins, and it very well might. So you might decide that's worthwhile, but I wouldn't say that's a requirement. I am not a quilt judge myself. So, you know, we probably should address these sorts of questions to a quilt judge. I should have one on the podcast, actually, and ask some of these questions. You know, how high does that rank? I think that from what I understand, what the judges look for is precision and neatness of execution. So if you have beautifully neat lock stitches and maybe it's hidden in seams or in points and you've thought that through, I think that ranks pretty well. If you do this tying and burying, but it's a bit sloppy and the lines don't quite join and there's a stitch width missing between them, I think that that would rank more poorly. Do you see what I'm saying? So the precision is a factor too, not just the tying and burying. So that said, you know, there's as many schools of thought about this as there are quilters, because I do personally know quilters who only tie and bury. Like, to them that matters, that those evidences of the machine stopping and starting are not there. To them it's critical and it's important. And whoever their long armor is, bless their heart, because they've got to tie and bury threads. But for the most part, I don't find that that's typical across machine quilting. The lock stitching is very, very much more common. So what else should we go with? We talked about the breaking bobbin thread, so I'll just run over that again a little bit. I tend to quilt until my bobbin runs out when I'm doing edge-to-edge work, right? I don't really worry about reading what the percentage is that's left. I just quilt till it runs out. And then those last few inches that don't have good tension on them, and you can see it because the top thread looks really straight. It doesn't have nice stitches because there was no bobbin tension holding it in place. Those last few inches, usually 2 or 3 or 4, I just undo, and then I go yet further until I get to a good, what I consider a good join place. So some kind of point or angle where I can, at that corner, you know, overlap my 3 or 4 stitches, 2 or 3 stitches, 1/4 inch-ish, and get that anchoring done in place there. And then I just continue on. I think the key, honestly, is learning to do it neatly. And there's really no shortcut to that except for practice. But, you know, using the ruler as an aid is a great idea. When you do want to use the ruler as an aid, though, make sure that you do have your ruler plate on. And I do today, too. I do not recommend at any time, it's just going to be a minute, just using your ruler on the arm of your machine. Because if you do, and if that ruler rocks, you're apt to break needle, ruler, and do all kinds of damage. So if you want to use the ruler for an aid, by all means do. Just make sure you have that ruler plate on to go with that. So any other questions about the stopping and starting? And I'm going to take a quick look at my notes here too to make sure that I've covered the things that I wanted to. Read the screen, Dave says. Susan, do you feel there's a specific thread brand you use that cuts down on thread breakage? That's a great question. And it comes at a timely place because, again, if you've watched my last couple live and unscripted episodes, they've been kind of fraught with thread breaks. They really have. And it's been an issue for me in the last couple of weeks, and I can't fully say I've found a solution. So I have for years, for hundreds of quilts, been using Isacord 100% polyester 40 weight thread. Usually I use it top and bottom because I like matching my threads, and I've had great success with that. And when the Bernina first came, that is what I continued with and had great success. Since then, I'm having this thread breakage problem. So now I'm experimenting. I don't have a lot of other thread in my studio. I only have 2 other brands at the moment. So I've used both of those, and I'm playing with different weights, top and bottom, kind of trying to get to the bottom of this and also trying to get to know my machine, because I feel like most high quality machines should be able to handle multiple brands of thread. So I don't think I would ever say, pick this one brand and stick with it. I know our machines have preferences, so it's hard to make a statement on this, but I really want to get to know my machine and to figure out what it's liking or not liking about weights or the how they work together, right? So I'm not going to say my machine doesn't like a 40 weight, but I might say my machine does not get good tension if I have 40 weight in the top and 100 weight in the bottom, right? So those sorts of variables I'm fiddling with. So short answer to that long conversation was, I don't have a specific brand to recommend. I don't. You've got to work with them and learn them, and each might have its own characteristics and might require some adjustments. Barbara, another good reason to use a 10 or 11 stitch length, easier to unstitch. Yes, good point. I do not recommend using 14 or 15 stitches to the inch if you're doing edge-to-edge work. It's difficult to unstitch. The only reason in my mind to use a stitch length that tiny is when you're doing tiny curved things, and a 10 or 11 stitch would look like it's going, making a hexagon instead of a circle. That's when you use tiny, tiny stitches. But for your average stitching, yeah, I don't recommend going tiny, tiny because it is really difficult to unstitch. Okay, more? Here we go. These stitches just came out so fast, it's taken me forever. Okay. And Sally, how do you remove stitches so quickly? Well, you guys, really, this is another tutorial, but I can show you a little bit, because why not?
Do you want to get the rest of the questions first in a bit?
Yes, Mr. Producer, bless his heart. He's keeping me on track. He's saying, read the rest of the questions first. So let's do that. Stay still, Stella. Stay. Lauren, I'm sorry, but when you're actually cutting the threads, are you cutting 3 threads or just 2? The cutting isn't on my screen. Thanks. Good question, Lauren. When I pulled up that bobbin thread, then I was cutting 3 because I had my top thread, and my bobbin thread was still a loop because it's still attached to the machine, right? So I cut right kind of at the end of that loop. And then I pull that attached bobbin thread out by pulling my machine away, leaving me with just the 2 that are attached to my quilt. Does that make sense? And I can do it again if we need to too, by all means. Angie, so it seems like for a thread color choice when burying, you would want to be sure that you don't see the buried threads underneath. Or is it supposed to be buried in the batting layer? Oh, that's a great question, Angie. Because it is true. You don't want to see those little thread tails underneath. So if, for example, you had a very white quilt top, that might be an issue. Gosh, I tie and bury so little, I don't know that I have great answers for you. But if there's piecing in the quilt, for example, you could make sure that your needle comes up under that piecing, and that would help. But the truth is those tails are still under there. But if you came up with your needle under the piecing and then you proceeded to do other quilting around it that held all those layers, I think those tails would stay where you put them, and I think you would be safe. I endeavor to make my needle go through the batting, but of course I can't really see that happening. I just make sure my needle is not all the way through to the bottom. So your thread tails should be in the batting, but you can't guarantee that, right? Because you can't see them. So I hope that helps a little bit. There's probably more experienced custom quilters than I who might have more input on that too and how they address that. More questions? They're still coming. Paulette, do you change your upper thread tension depending on your thread? How much thread breakage is normal when you're quilting? Thank you. Oh, great questions, Paulette. I do change my upper thread tension depending on my thread. Not a lot. I tend to change my bobbin tension a little bit first and then just do fine tuning on the top. And generally on my machine, I have found When all is working well and the machine is cleaned and oiled and stitching smoothly, I don't have to do vast changes because I'm usually stitching with polyester threads, and all that's differing is the weight of them. So it's not massive changes. If you're going to swing over to monofilament threads or metallic threads, you might need to do more drastic adjustments. And again, I'm not super experienced with those because I just don't typically use them. So ask people in Facebook groups. That's always my recommendation for specific questions like that, because someone out there is doing that kind of thing. It's just not me. We're just messing with the mic here. Mr. Producer had me muted for a minute so he could school me in how to wear my mic. Okay, next question. Sharon, sorry if you addressed this, but what needle are you using that you can thread it so easily? Mine is called a spiral eye needle, but they're also sold as self-threading needles. So the side of the eye actually has a little slit in it. So you have your taut thread and you draw your needle eye across it and it just slips right in there. Absolutely genius. Absolutely essential in my opinion if you're tying and burying threads. When the bobbin runs out and I take stitches to a good spot, the bobbin thread comes up a stitch away from the top thread. Yours looked like they were in the same spot. How did you do that? They're not. They're not. It's just like yours. The bobbin thread comes up one stitch away. Oh, Mr. Producer saying, step back, get out of the shadow. These are the conundrums, you guys. We keep changing lights up, and I currently have really bright shop lights overhead. It helps with the visibility and being able to see and generally having everything better lit, but it does create these eye shadows. So, we might have to adjust it yet again. We did this one already. Yep. Good deal. Okay, Savannah, is there a specific size self-threading needle that would work better than another? I don't think so. I think you want a fairly fine needle just so it doesn't make a big hole coming up. But you saw me run over it with my fingernail and make that, disappear again. You do want one that's reasonably long. Mine is on the short side, and I would say my needle is a little less than 2 inches long, perhaps 1 3/4. I wouldn't go shorter than that, because of that whole issue of trying to come up an inch away, right? You need a little bit of length in it. Jeannie, is your dead bar too high? It is supposed to be only 1/4 inch to 3/8 inch max above the sew head. It is actually, Jeannie, so I'm not sure what angle you're seeing that makes it look high. I am at the prescribed 5 millimeters right now of distance between my machine nose and my dead bar. Marianne, I'm getting nice tension with Superior Glide, but I do get breakage driving to the left. Any suggestions to lessen that happening? Good question, Marianne. And the end of one of the questions earlier is how much thread breakage is normal in a quilt. And I have to say, when things are going well, no thread breakage is normal in a quilt. I mean, I frequently have done multiple quilts without ever having the thread break throughout. So if it is breaking a couple, 3, 4 times in a quilt, something is amiss. And that's where I'm at right now, right? And even so, I'm sometimes getting a whole quilt. I did one yesterday. It was like a double-sized quilt. No thread breaks, no problem. Then I loaded a baby quilt, had 3, right? So it's not normal to have thread breakage happening on the regular. That usually means something is wrong. It usually means something is wrong. Okay, I've kind of lost my train of thought on that question again. Oh, moving to the left. I used to say on my Gamel and on other brands which have round shanked needles that tweaking the positioning of that needle could help, because your stitch is being formed by the needle going down and the rocker coming around and grabbing it. So the timing of those things happening, that's the timing of your machine. That's how a stitch is formed. And by turning the needle just a tiny, tiny touch, you could change when the needle and the rocker, when the thread and the rocker met, just a tiny touch. And that used to help me if I was having trouble moving smoothly in both directions. I could move my needle a little left or a little right and change that. On the Bernina, which to my knowledge is the only long arm, we have the same needles as you would use in sewing machines, so the flat shank needle, which makes loading your machine beautiful when you change the needle because it only goes in one way. You put the needle in, tighten it, done. It's lovely, but you can't mess with that change. So if you're sewing on a Bernina and it's not sewing to the left, I feel like it's got to be something else. I don't know that I know what it is. I will say my Bernina stitches happily in every direction. So that's the goal. That is the goal. I'm sorry, I'm not much more help there. Richard, hello from New Jersey. When I find that I'm getting thread breaks when going in a specific direction only, I change my needle. Even the slightest bend in it can cause that problem for me. You know, that is absolutely true, Richard. Fresh needle is kind of the go-to solution for any number of problems. And one other thing that I might add that has an effect there. Also, when your needle is going up and down very rapidly, there is a certain amount of flex happening in that needle as it enters and exits the fabric. So new needle helps with that, and tension of your fabric, how it's loaded, if you're on a long arm, plays into that as well. There's so many factors in every one of these problems that we're discussing, but that is one. So maybe try loosening up your quilt a little bit. I find that I should be able to stick my fingers up under the quilt and actually grab my fingertips. Do you want to show that at an angle, Dave, for a sec? You guys can see this. So my fingers are coming up and I can actually grab and pinch my fingers. Not easily, there's resistance, it's not floppy, but I only put enough tension on to keep things smooth. That's all the tension there is. It is not drum tight. I cannot bounce a quarter off it. Definitely not. So maybe try lessening up that tension a little bit, because that too plays into your needle entering and exiting and that whole stitch formation process, right? All these things play into it. Celia, I had a burr inside the throat plate. I taped a clear fake credit card on top of the throat area and it worked fine after that. No more thread breaks. How interesting. Mr. Producer is saying Dave Ramsey approves that message. Excellent use of a credit card, as I'm sure where he's going. Funny. If you know Dave Ramsey, you'll get the joke. Otherwise, not so funny. But I don't know how that would mess with the depth of your presser foot, though, your hopper foot. If it's working for you, I'm not going to say don't do it, but I would say that's kind of a last ditch solution. Is there any way that you can fix the burr that's on your throat plate? A couple episodes ago, we were talking about that, flossing through your thread guides to see if there are burrs in any of those. And if you find one, there are literally threads that have the same gritty quality as an emery board that you can get to floss through those thread burrs. So I wonder if you can do that on the throat plate as well, or super, super tiny fine grit sandpaper. Again, great question for Facebook groups, because I guarantee you someone else has had the same problem, right? And can chime in on a solution that they found. But I would really try and fix that burr. I mean, a new thread plate might not even be all that expensive. That might be worth your while too. You know, I keep saying this, but it's so true. There are so many variables that play into getting beautiful stitch quality and being able to stitch in every direction. It's kind of an endless troubleshooting technique to when you're having problems. Which one is it? And keep considering them. But, you know, nothing is off the table. But when you start having a throat plate that's got issues, you know, I would try and fix that issue, because that's going to interfere with your stitching eventually, I feel like. Cagney, also triage your thread path. Made a huge difference. Triage your thread path. Okay, what are you... Okay. Cagney is saying, examine. I think this is what I'm reading into it. Follow your thread path and examine it and make sure that it is correct. And follow it with the little flossing technique to make sure there are no burrs or sticking points or problems there, for sure. Dolores, how do you deal with dark threads showing through white fabric after it has been stitched? So by dark threads, you mean from the piecing. You know, a couple ways to do that. The first one is probably make sure your quilt back before you load it is well trimmed, that all those little stitches are well trimmed. I do have another secret needle that I keep. Can you see my little baby pincushion right here? It's supposed to be affixed there. I see it's coming loose. I keep two needles. One is the spiral eye and one is the snag nabbit, which does not actually have an eye, just has a little rough top. That's another way that you can pull out those troublesome threads if they're loose underneath, because it does happen. That's really the best way. Trim it and then pull out the ones that do show. Gainer, can stitching at a fast speed cause thread breakage? I find that I get shredding when stitching fast. I mean, it shouldn't. Our machines are designed, you know, with their top speed, and they should be able to stitch at a fairly fast speed. That's what they're all about. Check maybe for needle size relative to thread size when shredding is happening. Speed, it should be able to handle. The Sewing Corner. Hi, Susan. Have you tried the lasso method when burying threads? I saw Helen Godden demo it. No more shredding. I have not tried the lasso method. I'll have to look that up for tying and burying threads. Diane, we had a customer who was using fiberglass batting, so it was cutting her thread. Oh my, I've never even heard of fiberglass batting. Wow. See, again, consider every factor, as many factors as you can think of. Consider them. Cindy, ideas for how to unscrew those factory screwed-in screws. Where are they, Cindy? Is it throat plate or is it needle insertion? What screws are you talking about? And, you know, last ditch, I would reach out to your dealer or whoever you got the machine from, because how did they get installed? Have they got Loctite in them? Are they glued in place? Like, what's the deal there? Jan Vincent, there's an emery cord product that can be run back and forth through the thread plate hole. Yes, and I was talking about that in terms of the pigtails and things that our thread goes through. But I think the same thing might work on that throat plate. Yes, if you've got a burr on there. It's got to be fixable, I think. Okay, we were going to quilt something else. What was it? I have now forgotten. We were going to undo. That's what we were going to do. We were going to unstitch. Okay, let's do just a little bit of that. Probably the close-up. And I did do a reel on Instagram and Facebook about this recently too. But here's my biggest tip. Let me get my hand visible. What's the best? Can you move the little screen elsewhere, Dave? I think that would be better because I've got to get my machine to the right. Okay. See how I'm holding? This is my needle thread, okay? I'm holding it quite taut. You can see my quilt is actually lifting. And I've got about a 45-degree angle away from my quilt and directly away from the stitching. So I'm not off to one side of the stitching. I'm not flat down on the quilt. I'm pulling it up. This is key. So first what I would do is get that bobbin thread loose and going. And now I'll start pulling on my top thread. And as my stitching turns, I'll actually move my hand. So I'm pulling right out from that stitching and upwards. What that does is pulls up the bobbin threads. Can you see them? As I'm putting tension on this, it is literally pulling up that bobbin thread, and I can slide my seam ripper right under there. When you have quite a lot of undoing to do, as you get a long tail, you can see I'm winding it around my fingers and getting it really secure. You can actually just cut several of those bobbin threads. And again, you've got a good bit of tension on here, and every time you cut, of course, we're under the other stitching. Got to clip that. Every time you cut, see that? A whole bunch comes undone. And that works really, really slick. What's happening is my thread is now under the stitching. It's ideal to unstitch in reverse. Does that make sense? Because then the top layer would be coming off first. But I hope those little tips help you. I'll have to do a longer video about it sometime. But the beauty of that one is as you pull and as you clip those bobbin threads, not only is it fast, but the bobbin threads still are coming to the surface, so you don't have little bitty bits of thread residue underneath. They're all at the top, and you do have to pick them off, but they're all at the top. You can see them all. So that works really slick. But best and biggest tip is holding that thread. Savannah does her best frog impression. Ribbit, ribbit, yes. And this, by the way, is Jack, right? You know, he's Jack the Ripper. Yes. All kinds of ripping jokes, for sure. The law of sewing and ripping. I mean, on and on it goes. So good. I will move Stella. Okay. Do you want to put me on the camera again? Unless they just want to see the edge, which works too. So that's kind of my quick take on stops and starts. You know, ultimately, I think it's important to remember that how many of them you do or how anal you get about the perfectness of them, you know, the tying and bearing or not, all depends on you. So I give you permission to decide how much time you want to spend and how detailed you want to get about it. But at least now you're armed with some practical ways to do it, and you can go and practice them and decide which way is your favorite and which one you want to use the most. So like and subscribe if you have enjoyed this. The thumbs up really helps us to get viewed a little more often. And I will do my best to keep bringing you very real quilting from my studio. And again, we appear as many Fridays as we can. It's always Friday at 9 a.m. and we try and do it twice a month. So check back for these episodes. If you click on the bell, you'll get notifications whenever I'm coming live too. And if you sign up for my newsletter, I try. There's just me at this end, but I try to get out a newsletter with a picture and a kind of an outline of what I'll be talking about in the next episode. So just go to my website, stitchedbysusan.com, and you'll get a little pop-up there. You can opt in, and that will get you on my newsletter. And it comes out about every 2 weeks, so not too much email coming your way. Okay, I hope you've enjoyed this little episode, stopping and starting, and I hope you will join us next time for some more live and unscripted quilting. Thanks for joining me.